Hello everyone, and welcome to our open house. As you know, this is a series of several open houses that we do each term. My name is Michael Moyes, and I'm a student advisor here at Berklee. I've also taken several classes with the gentleman you can see to my left, Orchestration 1, Orchestration 2, and currently Composition for Film and TV, which he has authored all three of them and teaches them all as well. So what we're going to do today, we're going to have about 20 minutes of Q&A between myself and Ben, and then we're going to open up the Q&A to all of you for about 10 minutes, and we'll go from there. So let me introduce Ben. Ben has worked on, he's worked as a music supervisor and composer for dozens of TV shows, films, and stage productions for media corporations such as ABC, MTV, Fox, and Disney. His music has been heard on a staggering 2,000 plus episodes of television. As an assistant professor at the Berklee College of Music here in Boston, he taught music technology and production, and he authored the book Producing Music with Digital Performer, which is required here on campus and at a lot of other colleges as well, I believe. He's got a music education from the prestigious Eastman School of Music, as well as an MBA in entertainment from USC. Presently, Ben is spending his time working as a freelance music composer for the music industry in Los Angeles, here in Boston, and in New York City, primarily composing for concert and film music. So, welcome, Ben. It's good to have you here.
It's great to be here.
Yeah. And like I said, we're going to talk a little bit about some orchestration concepts, and then keep your questions coming so we can answer them at the end. First of all, something that we've talked about a bit in Orchestration 2, what are some different ways to differentiate melody and harmony, counter melody, and all of that, so it doesn't just sound like one big muddled mess?
Yeah, so this is a concept we talk a lot about in the orchestration curriculum. It's also just a concept in general that you see a lot in sort of orchestration texts and readings, and but it's the sort of concept of how to organize your thoughts when you have multiple ideas that are coexisting simultaneously. So that could be framed or termed in different ways. A common way to think of that is melody and counter melody and harmony. Or if you're not necessarily writing melodic music per se, a lot of people discuss it in sort of foreground, middle ground, and background terminology. But one of the things that we talk about in Orchestration 2 and at times in Orchestration 1 is sort of ways to organize your thoughts when you're writing that sort of music, because it comes up a lot. One of the beauties of orchestration is that there's many different solutions that will work. So for a moment, if you imagine you have a melody and a counter melody and a harmony, there's many different ways you could structure that music successfully using an orchestra. You could do a small texture that's very intimate and small, and you could say put the melody in a flute, counter melody in clarinet, and the harmony in harp. And that would be a very small and intimate texture, and it would sound great. But you could have another solution that's really big and grand, and that could be, the melody could be in all the upper strings and octaves, maybe the counter melodies in multiple horns in unison, and maybe the harmonies in like trombones and tuba and bass and bassoons. So those are two different solutions for the same melody, counter melody, and harmony that would give you different results, but they would both work really well. So the question becomes, how do you organize your thoughts in a way so that that gives you a sort of framework that you can use to guide your thinking in sort of situations of multiple musical ideas? So what we talk about in class is a sort of a three-step process, essentially. So you want to create separation between the ideas first, and then you want to balance those ideas in terms of projection power, and then the last is you want to guide the listener's attention to what you want to be the melody or the foreground. So in the separation which you brought up, there's different ways you can create separation between musical ideas. Four that we talk about in the class are giving two musical ideas different pitch ranges. So perhaps that flute melody was consistently higher than the clarinet counter melody, but giving them separate pitch ranges will create separation. You could also give them separate articulations. Maybe the flute melody is legato and the clarinet counter melody is staccato. That creates separation as well. Rhythmic differences is very common for creating separations, so they could have completely different rhythmic structures. One could be slower than the other, or they could be active at different times. That's also very common, and that would create separation between a melody and a counter melody. And the other is tone color. Like in the other example I cited, if you have a melody in all your strings and a counter melody in horns, that's a situation where you're getting a difference in tone color, and that will create separation of the ideas for the listener. So, assuming once you have that sort of separation between the ideas, you just want to make sure that they're balanced equally in terms of projection. So, in those examples that I sort of cited, you saw like a big melody paired with a big counter melody and a big harmony, or an intimate melody paired with an intimate and small counter melody and an intimate and small harmony. What you want to avoid is a really huge melody and a small accompaniment, or a really small melody and a huge accompaniment. You want them to be roughly equal in terms of projection. And then the last step would be to find ways to guide the listener to the melody or to the foreground. And ideally you want to try to do this with characteristics of the actual music as opposed to just, I'm going to make the melody really loud. So what are some other ways that we could sort of draw attention to the melody and the actual characteristics of the music? There's some things that we talk about in the class about things that grab the attention of the listener, things that are new. Basically, a newly entering instrument will grab the attention of the listener. Elements that evolve and change a lot grab our attention. Elements that don't evolve and are repetitious typically fade into the background. An example there is sort of hi-hats in a rock song. They're high, they're active. Normally those things grab our attention, but they're very predictable, so we don't pay a massive amount of attention to them, and we listen to the vocals and the lyrics instead. So new things, evolving things. Another is active elements. So if an element is sort of the busiest element, that tends to grab our attention. And another consideration is if all else is equal, we'll tend to pay attention to the highest element in terms of
like the highest pitch.
The highest pitch element, and consider that the melody. So all of those things are ways to sort of guide the listener to the foreground melody. But that process of creating separation, balancing the elements, and then guiding the listener to the foreground melody, if you follow those steps or use that to frame your thinking, as long as you do those things, you'll have a successful orchestration. And that's true of small orchestrations that are just flute and harp. It's also true in big settings that are all the strings and all the brass and the full orchestra.
Mm-hmm. You kind of mentioned the hi-hat sinking into your subconscious. You get it at first, and then it kind of melts into the orchestra. That happens with melodies a lot as well. What are some ways that you can use tone color to keep a melody interesting? Yeah,
so this is one thing that's awesome about an orchestra is, you go to an orchestra concert and there's 80 to 100 musicians up there, and if you're writing orchestral music, you have just a ton of potential tone colors that you can use. If you write a melody, you can give it to a flute solo, or a clarinet solo, or an oboe solo, or a trumpet solo, or violin solo, or the entire violin section, or all kinds of combinations of all these different instruments. So you have, from a tone color sort of palette standpoint, tons of potential things that you can do. And great orchestral music takes advantage of that. Essentially, if you think of your music as sort of a structure, you want that structure to sort of evolve. Maybe the melody starts in a clarinet solo, and then it goes to multiple horns in unison, and then it goes to strings and octaves. But as you're passing that material around the orchestra, the tone color of the material is evolving, and that creates interest for the listener. And that's a characteristic of pretty much all great orchestral music.
Mm-hmm. One thing I forgot to mention, there's a lot of guitar players out there, I believe, and bass players. Can you, that's right. Can you describe what tone color is for some people that might not know?
Tone color is just the sort of timbre of the sound or the timbre of the instrument. A lot of it is sort of dictated by essentially instrumentation, and a flute just has a different timbre or sound quality to
Right.
it than a piano, even if they're playing the same melody.
Right.
And you can vary that tone color or sound quality even within an instrument. I mean, a low flute sounds significantly different than a high flute does.
So it's not just like you play a low flute note and then crank up the volume. It's not going to sound the same as...
No, it's fairly specific to the instruments, so you have to get to know the instruments fairly intimately. The woodwinds in general, you can kind of think of them as sort of three instruments in one, if that makes sense. Like low flute has a certain tone color to it, high flute has a certain tone color to it, and sort of mid-range flute has a sort of tone color to it that are unique. And I mean, the only really way to get to know those sort of intimately is to listen to recordings of the instruments or listen to people playing the instruments live. So a certain amount of just learning orchestration is listening to the orchestra. Preferably if you have the score, the actual music, so you understand what they're playing.
Right.
That helps a lot, so that when you're actually writing, you can remember, oh yeah, I remember I saw, this structure, or I saw that low flute and bolero, or whatever it happens to be.
So when you're just staying on the flute example, so if I'm playing, I want to have a big crescendo from pianissimo up to fortissimo. How would I do that effectively in a full orchestra without just having every instrument start really, really quiet and then get louder?
Yeah, so this is, again, something that's awesome about an orchestra, there's just such wide potential dynamics. I mean, a low flute solo is whisper soft.
Right.
There's a lot of things. A really soft tam-tam hit is incredibly soft. But the full orchestra playing forte or more is really loud. So it's just a capability of the ensemble that is awesome. And if you can incorporate it into your music, you want to do that. So if you have like say a long crescendo, ways that you can essentially try to enhance that with the orchestration. Probably the most common approach is to essentially start with smaller, limited instrumentation and gradually add instruments as you build the crescendo. So you can think of that as sort of addition, basically. So you do start with a flute solo, and maybe by the end of it, you gradually add instrumentation. So maybe you add the rest of the woodwinds, and then you add the rest of the strings, and then you add the brass, and then you get to your big forte, and the cymbals go boom. But that's probably the most common and significant approach. You can take that sort of addition concept even step further and look at the specific instruments and see if there's any way I can have, say, a string instrument. Normally you're playing one note and you have one string vibrating. Is there any way I can have them play two notes and I have two strings vibrating essentially on each instrument? So there's ways you can take that sort of additive dynamics into each instrument. Maybe like strings, for instance, you can have them play double stops, and they'll play they're playing two notes at once then, so they're playing essentially, we have more vibrating strings, and that creates more sound. Timpani is an example. They have two mallets, so if you want to, at that climax, you can have them roll on two drums, and you have two vibrating drum heads. So you can look within the instruments to see if there's a way you can do that sort of additive dynamics as well. The other consideration that is very prominent in that situation is considering the ranges of the instruments, particularly brass and woodwinds like clarinet and flute. As they go higher in their register, they're going to be able to play louder, and you'll see a lot of writing where as you have a crescendo evolve, the brass will sort of transfer to their upper register. And if all of this stuff, you can reverse it if you're doing a diminuendo,
right?
And essentially subtract instrumentation and transfer the brass that are lower register and things like that. But those are probably the most common ways to enhance dynamics with the orchestration ideas.
You mentioned playing double stops. This is a question that I'm sure you get quite often when string sections play Debussy. So where one half of the section plays one note and the other plays a different note. Is that another way to increase volume?
Well, this is an interesting topic because it's a little bit of a dangerous situation. And the situation is this: you're sitting at your keyboard, you're using your samples. You say, I'll just Davizi the violin 1 because I want a big sound, right? And I want lots of notes, So you play in 2 notes for your violin part, and your mock-up, your MIDI sequence gets bigger because you just went from playing 1 note to playing 2 notes. So you went from triggering 1 audio file to triggering 2 audio files. Your sound magically gets bigger. You think this is good. And then, your client says, this is awesome, I love it. And then you go to your recording session and you have that same part and you hand it to the violin section, and your violin section is, 12 players or 14 players, whatever. And now, you went from having your melody in your violin section being played by 14 violinists, but you wrote that Davizi part in there. So now all of a sudden your melody's only played by 7 violinists. So that's a situation you just have to be careful because essentially the sequencer and the mock-up behave differently than the live ensemble does. In the live ensemble, when you do a Davizi part, you go from 14 violinists to 7 per part.
Right.
When you're sitting behind your computer, that you just trigger a second sample,
right,
and it gets bigger.
So then you actually have 28 violins.
Right. So it's like you essentially have 28 violins.
Yeah.
So the sort of rule of thumb is that Davizi is very, very useful. It's most useful in background harmonic parts, because the extra notes that are possible when you Davizi the section are really helpful for filling in harmonies.
Right.
But it's background materials, so it's okay if it's a little thinner in terms of tone color and projection. If you want it to be foreground melody, then that's when you don't want.
You just want a single line.
Yeah, you want to take you want to take that big melody that you want to be big strings. You want to give it the violin 1, you want to give it the violin 2, you want to give it the viola, and you want to give it the cello, all in octaves. So to get the big string sound, if you're thinking to yourself, I want big strings, then that's when you don't want Davizi. That's when you want to double the sections. Because then, if you double the sections in the live setting, it behaves like what we were talking about with the samples. When you're playing extra notes, you're triggering 2 samples instead of 1. If you take violin 1 and you add violin 2 and you add viola, then you're going from 14 violins to 26 violins, etc.
Right.
So the general rule of thumb is if you want big strings, use doubling, and Davizi is awesome and very useful on background harmony parts.
I want to go in kind of a different direction because a lot of people, well, first of all, you teach a class called Composition for Film and TV.
Right. You've
obviously written a lot of concert music, and you've written a lot for film and TV as well. What are some different considerations when writing for film and TV?
There is a lot of overlap. A lot of these considerations are the same. I think most of the things that we've already talked about apply regardless of whether you're writing for concert music or film and TV. Some things are different. If you're writing music for TV or film, you're not the only audio element. There's dialogue, there's sound effects, and a lot of times those, your client or producer thinks that those things are more important than music, and sometimes, frankly, they're right. So as you're writing, you need to take into account the other audio elements, whether or not you want to write music that naturally stays under dialogue. So you could say, okay, this is an intimate conversation between 2 people inside going on the screen. So maybe there you would want to use less instrumentation, a smaller instrumentation, or maybe sustained textures to sort of stay sort of below the dialogue. That's one consideration that's very prominent, that comes up a lot. I think another thing that is very different from a creative standpoint is just that if you're writing for film, you don't have control over timing so much. If you're writing concert music or just music for yourself, you can do whatever you want. You can develop an idea for however long you want to develop it for. In film music, you have to follow the plot. You have to follow the timing that they were in this scene for so long, and if they change scenes, you have to change the music. In an ideal situation, you can still work in all these ideas. The sort of general concept of moving material around the orchestra, as an example. If you can align those changes, say you have a flute melody, And maybe that flute melody happens during an intimate conversation on screen. And if you're writing concert music, maybe you'd want to take that flute melody and transfer it to strings and octaves. If you can be writing a film score, maybe there's a scene change and it goes from that intimate conversation inside, and then there's a picture cut and it's a big panorama of mountains or something like that. Mm-hmm. If you can align your sort of evolution of your music from flute solo to the big strings and octaves with picture cuts and changes in the plot and the storyline, essentially anytime the audience gets new information in terms of plot and setting, things like that, they have an emotional response. And you want to try to align your changes in your music with the moments that the audience is having those emotional responses, sort of new information on the screen. So to the extent that you can align those things, it really helps the film scoring side of things.
So it's not enough just to write a piece of music and then have the mix engineer kind of make one part quieter and one part louder.
Well, ideally, there is going to be a mixing engineer involved, and he's going to have the ability to raise or lower your music, but they like you a lot more if the actual compositional ideas make their job easy. So, for instance, if you do use smaller instrumentation or more sustained textures during a detailed, intimate conversation, they might not have to lower the music very much.
Right.
And that makes them happy because it's less work for them. And it makes you happy because your music's louder. Mm-hmm. So to the extent that you can actually accommodate sound effects and dialogue in the actual compositional ideas and the actual orchestration, it's better for everyone involved.
Yeah.
Especially you, because your music, it will get mixed louder.
Mm-hmm. Looks like we do have some questions from the audience here. How do you overcome composer's blocks? This person's looking for different methods to force creativity.
Ooh, composer blocks. Deadlines help. I personally think listening to a lot of music helps, and listening to music you love helps, even if it's not necessarily music that's, say you're writing on a project that's a certain style. Just sometimes listening to something you love, even if it's not that style of the project you're on, can just sort of get you excited about music. Mm-hmm. I mainly listening, and there's Stravinsky who said, good composers borrow, great composers steal. There's a certain amount of borrowing that can be done that can help if you're truly in a creative block situation. One thing that you can try doing is looking at pieces of music that you like and and you think would be effective in the project you're working on, and don't necessarily recreate them exactly, but maybe sort of pull out their basic underlying structure and say, okay, this is a melody, counter melody, and harmony, and the harmony is in sustained strings, and the melody is in a horn solo, and the counter melody is in an English horn. Okay, well, I could use that. And apply it to my own melody, counter melody, and harmony. And that a lot of times, sort of doing that gives you a guideline or framework that can sort of kickstart things.
Oh, here's a couple more. They're coming in fast. Good job, guys.
Yeah, good job, guys.
This is a great question. What were the most influential orchestral pieces for you?
Ooh. I like a lot of romantic period, late romantic period music. Yeah. There's some new stuff. I use a lot of examples by a composer named Christopher Rouse. I studied with him many years ago at Eastman School of Music, and he now teaches at Juilliard. But he writes some really good music that I really admire. If anyone has some spare time, look up the Flute Concerto by Christopher Rouse. One of the best pieces of music I think that's been written in a very long time. And not a lot of people really know about it so much, but that's something that's a great piece of music. But I love my Stravinsky, I love my Tchaikovsky, Shostakovich, those guys. It's great music.
How do you spell his last name?
Oh, Christopher Rouse, Rouse.
Great. There's a question from Tommy. In your opinion, what's an effective way to increase suspense during a scene?
Hi, Tommy. Thanks for coming. Increasing suspense. I mean, I always approach a scene as looking at the scene and essentially saying, what do I want the audience to feel? And I mean, I tend to think harmonically, usually first. So, you know, there's a certain amount of it's not even music at this point. You're looking at the scene almost from like pretend you're a literature professor or something like that, and you're like, okay, what's the plot going on here, and how's the audience going to feel, and who do they relate to in this scene, and what is happening to that person, what perspective do they see, and you factor all those things in, and you say, okay, I want the audience to be scared right now, and then at least this is what the process I end up going through, where, okay, I want them to be scared. What musical ideas do I know that enhance that emotion? And, you know, maybe it's sustained strings in a 12-tone cluster. You know, if I want them to feel like they're happily in love, you know, then it's major keys and pretty melodic lines. But I end up sort of defaulting to, first, what's the scene, what's the emotion I want? And then second, what are musical structures that I know produce those emotions? That's a very general answer, but
that's a good answer. Here's a question that I'm sure a lot of people have. For somebody trying to break in, do you suggest building a portfolio by scoring a handful of short films? And should I be charging?
That's two questions. I mean, you know, I'm a musician. There's something that turns my stomach about doing stuff for free. I've had experiences where I've done things for free, and the problem with doing that is it's really hard to then turn that person into a paying client. That's been my experience. Once they get you for free once, they're always coming back wanting free stuff. So it's challenging, in my experience, to sort of turn that person into a sort of paying customer, so to speak. That's not to say that you shouldn't necessarily do it. You know, maybe you do a project for free or for not that much money just to build a portfolio, and that's a legitimate reason to do it. So, you know, I guess that's a personal decision that's really up to the individual. There's pros and cons. But I do think you can use that as a way to build a portfolio. Building a portfolio it's a sort of, you need examples, you need stuff to play people. I'm a composer, I don't have anything to play to demonstrate my composing abilities. It doesn't really work. So you need to have some things that you've written that you can play as examples of your work. Preferably just music, and other time, you know, they'll probably ask for examples that are to picture as well if you're writing for film scores.
Right.
I don't, when I've sent out demos or you know, sort of portfolios on myself, I default to sending just the music. The reason is that you're sending it to film people, and film people think about lighting and plot and all this sort of things.
Sure.
And if your music's in a scene, they stop listening to your music magically, and they pick on the lighting or the plot, or it's not their actor or something like that. And sometimes I've found if I send them just my music, they listen to the music and they think about the music, and then in their mind they imagine their own project, and then they think, oh, this would work for my project, or this would not work for my project. And at that point, if they like it, they're going to call you and say, do you have any examples that are to video?
Right,
and then you can set them, and you go, hey, why don't I come over and I'll show them to you?
Yeah.
You know, so that's sort of my general approach to it. But those things, you know, a lot of people do different methods. So there's a lot of sort of personal decisions there. At the end of the day, it just comes to building relationships. You need to get to know people who make movies, or if you're writing concert music, you need to get to know conductors.
Sure.
So you need to figure out who is your client, who is your customer, and what's the product that I'm offering for them. And then you need to find those people, and then you need to spend time with them and convince them that you're a musical genius and that they have to hire you.
Right.
So
Here's a good question from Roger. In film and TV, do you write the music after viewing the final video edit, or do you work on musical ideas and make them fit to the image?
Hi, Roger. Thanks for coming. I've done both. Some of that ends up being sort of dictated to you by the working habits of the producer, director, and the production company. I've done a fair amount of TV music where I write it, and I never even see the picture.
Really?
Yeah, where they'll just, we need a scene. It's I don't know, it's a blind date and for a dating show in Paris, and we need some love music with some accordion in it. So you write, you don't even see it, but you get up your sort of love chord progressions, and you write your strings, and you add some French accordion in there and send it off, and they use it or they don't use it. But a lot of feature films aren't going to work that way. You're going to be given a sort of scratch version of the film, and you get to compose to that.
Sure.
And hopefully they haven't put in a temp track and said, we want the temp track, just rip it off.
Right.
That happens a fair amount as well. But I guess the answer to the question is it's sort of project dependent, and sometimes it's both of those situations.
I've got a question from Steven that was, sorry, this is the last question as well. Actually, we can do one more if you have time for one more.
We can do one more.
All right. There'll be one more question after this one. This is a question from Steven that was kind of related to what we were talking about a second ago. He wants to know where he can find videos to practice on for his portfolio.
That's actually a little tough. It's the problem is things tend to be copyrighted, and a lot of people do different things. Some older silent movies are available; they're not copyrighted anymore. That's something that a lot of people do. You can actually go through sort of sometimes, and just for practice purposes, you can look through DVDs, and deleted scenes sometimes don't have music. Sometimes DVDs will separate the music and have like a narrated version, or things like that. You can look through those for practice purposes. But those things are all copyrighted, so you can't broadcast it to the world when you're done.
Right.
Probably the one thing a lot of people do is look for student films, because students are just excited to have someone who's like, I'm going to write music for your movie, and they'll tend to let you use it for your own sort of demo purposes as well. Those are the sort of approaches that I've seen people do.
Yeah. I might be making this up. I don't think I am, but I think on YouTube one time, I don't know, I wish I remember what I searched for, but I came up with a whole bunch of results of Pixar short films from their junior animators, just 3 to 5 minute films that they were throwing out there, and there were people that were scoring. I think it was just the actual tracks with the audio, with the sound effects, basically. Yeah. And there were people that were posting their own scores to it. I don't know. You'll have to do some research on that. But
yeah, you just have to be a little careful.
It might get pulled down.
Yeah, there's potential copyright issues. So if you're just doing it to practice in your own studio, a lot of times you can essentially do whatever you want. It becomes a little sticky when you start putting it up on your own website or throwing it up on YouTube and things like that. Then you got to be careful.
Right. And we've got one last question from Anonymous. Where do you look for jobs and opportunities if you're trying to get into the film scoring industry?
Everybody, welcome Anonymous. Everybody does a lot of different things. There's industry databases. I actually have a blog on Berkleemusic.com where I put up just some industry databases that you can get. Some are available online for free, and some cost money. But things like the Hollywood Creative Directory is an example of they'll just list production companies that make movies. They'll list all the agents and things like that. So you literally can go through there and you have everyone's phone number. You then start calling everyone, and you'll have everyone's address, and you can just drive and knock on their door. I I personally, I started in LA. I've got something called a LA 411. You can go to la411.com, and that will list essentially post-production companies. But I started in LA. I got that, and I started with the music production companies. And I started at A, and I called them. And I called the companies, and I said, hey, if I was going to bring my resume over, who would I write the letter to? And then sometimes I'd get a name, sometimes I wouldn't. But if I got a name, I just drove to the actual business. Mm-hmm. I walked in the front door and I said, is Chris available? And that actually got me my first job.
Really?
So, yeah. But I mean, you just have to, you have to have a certain level of confidence and just go. You can make the phone call, you can knock on the door, you can send the email. Mm-hmm. You got to sort of reach out to them in some way. If you don't know anyone at all, the databases are a good start.
Yeah.
But I don't know if we can add a link to that blog post or something. But
I'm sure. We can.
But there's the Hollywood Creative Directory, LA 411. There's some Film Music Network databases too come to mind as things that you can get that will just give you some phone numbers to start.
Mm-hmm. Sounds great. Just work ethic and persistence.
Most of it is
just like doing anything. It's
yeah,
good.
Most of it's knocking on doors.
That's great.
And having a somewhat charming personality goes a long way.
You have no problem there, definitely.
You don't either, Michael.
Well, thank you very much for joining us. It's been a real treat to have you here, all the way from LA back to Boston. And
good to be here.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks again, Ben.
Hey, thank you.
It's been a pleasure.
Thanks for coming, everyone.
Mm-hmm.